Basic biological mechanisms and psychological learning processes remain remarkably uniform. A biological reflex or response to light looks identical regardless of geographic borders. While sociology focuses on group interaction and psychology examines the individual mind, anthropology analyzes the cultural ground rules. These are the embedded codes of conduct and belief systems that dictate a specific group's behavior. These environmental stimuli provide the inputs that shape distinct social identities. They provide parameters that define what makes a Russian, or an American. When groups with different backgrounds occupy the same physical space, their distinct definitions of right, wrong, and legality intersect. Anthropologists refer to the resulting tension as culture conflict. This suggests that crime often emerges from the friction of these cultural ground rules rubbing against one another in shared environments. The United States contains a uniquely heterogeneous population. Historical expansion, annexation, and immigration have forced dozens of distinct ethnic and racial groups to navigate a single dominant legal framework. We can track the intensity of this overlap through social distance. This metric measures the friction and isolation that occur when minority subcultures interact with, or are excluded by, the dominant culture's legal and economic systems. This matrix maps that demographic tension. The horizontal axis measures social distance, while the vertical axis tracks socioeconomic integration, a group's access to capital and institutional power. Tracing a group's position reveals a consistent relationship between social isolation and arrest statistics. We can test this relationship against three distinct demographic stress tests: the rapid shift in female gender roles during the late 20th century, the economic isolation of migrant laborers, and the shock of mass refugee influxes. Mapping these variables of social distance and integration helps identify the mechanics behind demographic shifts in criminal behavior. Historically, female involvement in the criminal justice system was a fraction of male involvement. For decades, the prison population ratio hovered around 1 woman for every 27 men. Biological factors, such as lower androgen levels, were historically paired with strict cultural protectionism. Traditional structures restricted women to domestic spheres, limiting their exposure to the environments where complex crimes typically occur. The cultural landscape shifted in the 1960s and 1970s. The rejection of strict Victorian values and the emergence of equal rights movements pushed women directly into the mainstream socioeconomic systems. Between 1960 and 1973, arrest rates reflected this transition. Male arrests increased 27.8%, while female arrests climbed 95.3%. Among juveniles, the disparity was sharper. Male arrests rose 123.5%, but female arrests climbed an astounding 264.1%. The nature of these offenses changed as well. Prior to the 1970s, women in criminal enterprise typically acted as decoys for male accomplices. By the mid-70s, women were increasingly executing heavy crimes independently. High-profile revolutionary female offenders operating heavy weaponry during bank robberies became a symbol of this shift. The criminal profile of women expanded as their cultural rules evolved. As the cultural ground rules and socioeconomic access for women moved toward parity with men, their systemic crime rates followed a similar trajectory. Agricultural streams and seafood processing workers in places like Unalaska represent populations existing in severe socioeconomic deprivation. Hundreds of thousands of transient workers travel enormous distances annually, moving from Florida to New York or Texas to Michigan, often trapped in seasonal labor without the capital to establish permanent businesses. By the 1980s, the median income for a migrant worker was $3,900 a year, less than half the official poverty level. Their life expectancy averaged 49 years, compared to the national average of 73. Despite enduring these conditions, their overall crime rates remain remarkably low. An anthropological lens suggests that a culture of futility creates a defeated psychological state. The energy required to plan and execute complex crime is often extinguished by the sheer exhaustion of daily survival. Complex criminal enterprise requires a baseline of agency and organization. Among migrant populations, criminal infractions are largely limited to survival theft and minor weekend disputes. Chronic economic and social isolation appears to suppress complex crime, leaving only raw survival mechanics in its place. In 1980, the Florida coastline experienced an acute demographic shock. Overloaded vessels carrying surplus populations arrived in massive waves, testing regional infrastructure. During the Mariel boat lift, Fidel Castro opened the port of Mariel, leading to the arrival of over 124,000 Cubans in a few months. This group included roughly 2,400 individuals released from Cuba's prisons and mental health facilities. The sudden overload on housing, medical services, and law enforcement created an immediate cultural clash. Local systems designed for social control were strained by the sheer volume of new arrivals. Dade County homicides reflected this pressure. In 1979, the county recorded 320 murders. In 1980, the year of the boat lift, the total reached 515. Isolating the data shows that only about 25% of this homicide increase was directly attributed to the Mariel refugees. The rest of the violence was a symptom of the escalating narcotics trade. Traffickers exploited the overloaded environment, increasing drug-related assassinations, while police resources were diverted to managing the influx. The region eventually stabilized. Earlier waves of middle-class Cuban immigrants had already established an economic foundation in Miami, which allowed the city to absorb the shock and develop into a bicultural banking hub. Acute mass migration triggers temporary spikes in violent crime by overwhelming local systems, but these rates typically subside as social distance decreases through assimilation. At the intersection of high integration and high criminal activity is the dissocial offender. These individuals typically present as psychologically stable, yet they operate under a value system that directly contradicts dominant laws. They adapt to a subculture where criminal behavior is the norm. They often maintain functional relationships and social standing, but within an illegal framework. Organized crime represents the ultimate manifestation of this dissocial ecosystem. Syndicate leaders like Frank Costello associated with judges and politicians, blending into high society while operating their enterprises with corporate precision. Late 1970s data highlights this sector's scale. The auto industry grossed $125 billion, street crime generated $4 billion, organized crime brought in $150 billion. This revenue comes directly from the general public paying for illegal goods and services, gambling, loan sharking, and narcotics. Organized crime functions as a rational economic structure, filling specific market demands that legal institutions refuse to meet. Historically, organized crime has served as a mechanism for upward mobility. Marginalized immigrants, facing high social distance and blocked from legitimate capital, utilized dissocial networks to build wealth and eventually enter the dominant culture. Plotting our cases on the matrix, female offenders move toward the center as access equalizes. Migrants remain in the bottom right, refugees show volatile movement, and organized crime occupies high distance, high integration. As groups move toward lower social distance, their crime rates stabilize. This is the heterogeneity paradox. A diverse population provides a base for economic growth and cultural depth, but the friction of assimilation produces crime as a byproduct. The anthropological approach forces us to look past the individual. By zooming out, we can stop treating crime as a failure of personal morality and start recognizing the systemic mechanics involved. Crime is the mathematical byproduct of cultural boundaries, social distance, and systemic inequality. Change the parameters of the culture, and the crime changes with it.